opening few minutes of that summit in Reykjavik, Reagan, his typical way of throwing people off balance with his old negotiating skills from, I think, from Hollywood ultimately, he says to Gorbachev, we have a wheat deal with you that you're not living up to. You haven't honored the terms of the agreement. How come you're not buying all the wheat you said you'd buy? And Gorbachev's answer says, essentially what he said was, well, we're broke. We don't have the hard currency. We can't afford it. And then he adds, that's because oil prices have collapsed. And then his next sentence was, and we know who started that, don't we? See, one of the strategies of the Reagan administration, there's some controversy about this, but one of them was to drive down the price of oil in the mid-1980s, because that was the leading hard currency earner for the Soviet Union, to put economic pressure on him. And there was Gorbachev acknowledging that the screws had been put to him by Reagan. To say that little exchange has been missed because of all the other stuff that happened there that was so interesting. So even as conservatives are dismayed that Reagan is caving in to Uncle Mikhail, he still gives the tear down this wall speech in Berlin in June of 1987. And then in March of 1988, he gives a speech in Massachusetts where he talked about Jeane Kirkpatrick and her great essay on dictatorships and double standards. And it was a very tough anti-communist speech. It got almost no coverage in the American press because this was old hat by now. I think it was like on page 10 of all the papers. But the next day, George Shultz turns up in Moscow to meet with Gorbachev to talk about the preparations for the June summit in Moscow that Reagan was coming to. And Gorbachev is furious about the speech. Essentially what he wants to know is President Reagan going to come over here in June and embarrass me by talking that way? And Shultz says, no, it'll be fine. Although Reagan did purposely stop and visit dissidents. Told his motorcade to stop and walk in and see Sakharov and other people, which upset the Soviet Union. So the point is you saw the same Reagan all the way through, but a person who was clever enough to calibrate his responses from moment to moment, and even in those conversations with Gorbachev, being friendly and conciliatory on one hand, and being tough as nails on the other. And there's lots more can be said about that. I'll end with a brief further meditation on domestic policy. I end the book by raising the question of, did Reagan achieve his broadest aims that he set out for himself? In his first inaugural address, he said that his aim was to reverse the size and scope of the federal government and its effect on our lives. And he had some admirable successes in reforming regulation, throwing out some areas of regulation like antitrust policy that dated back to the New Deal that even now are not really creeping back, maybe a little bit, but pretty much you had some real revolutions in some areas and not in others. The government even adjusted for population growth and inflation, and spending was larger at the end of his 8 years than when he arrived there. So why didn't Reagan succeed more in reducing the size of the federal government? And I came to the conclusion that Reagan was more successful in rolling back the Soviet empire than he was in rolling back the domestic government empire, chiefly because the latter is a harder problem. Or in my somewhat more whimsical moments, I say the Soviet Union was easy compared to the EPA. Governor Mitch Daniels of Indiana, who was in the Reagan political office in the White House, commented shortly after Reagan left office. He commented thusly, "The Reagan years will be for conservatives what the Kennedy years remain for liberals. The reference point, the breakthrough experience, a conservative Camelot. At the same time, no lesson is plainer than that the damage of decades cannot be repaired in any one administration." Close quote. And again, if you go back, Reagan himself perceived this. Starting in 1987, when Reagan was in a heap of trouble because of the Iran-Contra scandal, he began giving a series of speeches. They started on July 4th, but then he gave this out on the hustings and devoted several of his radio broadcasts to an old idea of Martin Anderson, one of his top economic advisors, that he called the Economic Bill of Rights, the same phrase that Franklin Roosevelt had used from time to time. And it consisted of 5 constitutional amendments he thought should be adopted. The first 2 were familiar to everyone, and he talked about from his first day in office. He said we should have a balanced budget amendment, and we should have an amendment giving a president a line item veto so that he or she can, get rid of pork barrel spending and earmarks and all the things we complain about. But he had 3 others he thought should be considered. And these, by the way, harken back to some of his ideas that he advocated for California as governor. He said there ought to be an amendment requiring a 2/3 vote of Congress for a tax increase. The next one was unspecified, but he wanted a constitutional spending limit, some set proportion of GDP above which Congress could not spend. He didn't specify an amount. That would be left open for us to debate and think about. And then the last one is the one that I think sows his prescience in a lot of ways. He also wanted a constitutional amendment banning wage and price controls. Now, if you go back to the late 1980s, we'd broken the back of inflation. Pretty much everyone realized that wage and price controls didn't work and were a hopeless idea, and no one was talking about bringing back wage and price controls. And yet here we are today in 2009, controlling the wages of bankers, and perhaps not far away from controlling the prices of all the healthcare sector instead of just part of the healthcare sector. And who knows, if we get a large burst of inflation here in the next 18 to 24 or 36 months, wouldn't be at all surprising to see the current management say, well, maybe we need some wage price controls or incomes policies, which was another goofy idea floated in the late 1970s. Now, all those amendments have their defects, by the way. They may not be good ideas. There are good arguments, good conservative arguments against them. But nonetheless, one can imagine a couple of things. One is if any or all of those were in place, how it would handcuff the current administration in its agenda of government gigantism, as I call it. And also, if you argue about those kinds of matters, even if you don't get a vote on those amendments, which they never would have passed in the late 80s or even the early 80s, Reagan, I think, showed the example of how you keep the initiative in politics even if you're losing particular battles, if you stay on the attack. And if you start the conversation about what should be the limits on government, well, you may get somewhere with that. So I've been suggesting that a lot of people say, what would Reagan's lesson be for today? I say, well, go back and look at his constitutionalism. Those particular 5 amendments, but also other ways he talked about the nature of limited government, and revive that argument. I call it Reagan's unfinished agenda, and I think that's the one that his would-be heirs today should look to and try and emulate. So I will stop there, and we want to do some questions for a little while. Is that the, oh yeah, we've got plenty of time. So, thank you all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hayward. And we are going to have time for questions, so I'll come around with the mic, and we give preference to students for the afternoon.
Thank you very much for speaking. My name is Max Morris. I'm a senior here. And you spoke briefly about Iran-Contra. I'd be curious to hear what you believe President Reagan's role was in the affair and how his White House reacted. Was there a cover-up?
Yeah. I go into a lot of that story. I mean, some of the better books on it are also very large, so it's a very complicated, intricate story. But I think there's sort of 3 or 4 things that should be focused on. One is I actually do try and place it against a constitutional backdrop, which is the sort of the no man's land of the Constitution for control of foreign policy. The President's commander-in-chief, but Congress appropriates. It's quite within the prerogatives of Congress to make appropriations or not to the Contras, and they kept changing their mind about this, which is no way to run a coherent foreign policy. And Reagan complained about you can't run a foreign policy with 535 bosses. So on the one hand, and then on the other side is the questions of, can the President's power to conduct foreign policy be limited in certain ways? There were, I think, there were 5 bold amendments? I lost count. There were 5 different amendments, each with different language, each with different interpretations, trying to bind the hands of the executive branch. And there's very good arguments that that amendment could not apply actually to the office of the President and his National Security Council. So that in fact what they were doing was, narrowly speaking, legal. They made some technical mistakes along the way with one of the Arms Control and Export Act, but there were never any prosecutions brought on any of those particular laws, by the way. All the indictments that were made were conspiracy. In Oliver North's case, it was accepting an illegal gratuity, which is pretty far removed from what upset Congress about it in the first place. So that's a first clue. What Reagan knew, I don't think there was a cover-up, quite the opposite. They very quickly surrendered, perhaps unwisely, I think, any claims of executive privilege they could have made about their documents.